Great. Welcome. My name's Jeff Goldhagen. I'm a pediatrician here in the University of Florida in Jacksonville and president of the International Society for Social Pediatrics and Child Health. We want to welcome you as a community committed to addressing the critical issues related to the impact of climate change on children. This is the second of 8 sessions learning sessions that ISSOP will be presenting over the next several months through September to explore and bring together those of us who are committed to addressing these issues. ISSOP, for those of you who may or may not be aware of who we are, is an organization that's been in place now for more than 4 decades that is committed to addressing the critical social and environmental issues that are impacting children globally, from climate change to globalization to issues related to children on the move, to violence against children, impact of conflict on children, and so on. These are the global issues that we're addressing that have ramifications to all of us from the global to the local level. Certainly, climate change is amongst, if not the most important issue that we're addressing, as it's existential and really relates to the future of all of us, and in particular, children and young adults. One of the critical differences, I think, between ISSOP and many other organizations is that we are grounded in the principles, standards, and norms of child rights. All of the work that we do is based on the principles of child rights and relates to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and other key documents that exist on the global stage. And so we welcome you today to participate in this second session of, as I mentioned, the 8 sessions we'll be having into the future. One of the critical issues we need to address is your involvement. And that is these learning sessions are meant to be more than a presentation of information and a didactic presentation, but really meant to inform us. And then after each of the didactic sessions, we'll be breaking out into breakout rooms where we can begin to discuss strategically how we are going to translate the knowledge that was presented actually into action. So we really urge you to continue to be with us after the sessions, after the didactic sessions, and join the breakout rooms. And we'll be talking more about actually how to do this as we move forward. I need to take just a moment to thank the University of Florida, who's providing the platform for us to work on today. Miguel Perez, who you'll be hearing from, who's the head of our divisions and departments IT program, and he's been diligently working to make all of the IT processes work, which in our first session he did dramatically well. And also a young woman, Eva Goldhagen, who just coincidentally has the same last name as I and looks conspicuously like me. And I need to thank Eva as well. I'm going to take a moment to be shameless here to present the ISSOP signature here, our logo, and to again ask you to plead with you to participate with us and join us on our journey. Whether we're dealing or addressing climate change or globalization, or again, a host of the other issues that are impacting children globally, we need your insight, we need your knowledge, we need your expertise, we need your support in order to be able to participate and to be able to gather all the resources and assets that exist globally to apply to these issues. So in that context, you can see in front of you the email address or the web address for ISSOP, which is just issop.org. We welcome you to join our organization. Interestingly enough, there are no membership fees to join. So that shouldn't be a barrier to anyone, but we do ask for a donation if you can afford to do so. But please, we need your participation in order to succeed, as well as we all wish to impact the health and well-being of children globally. I'm going to stop here and turn the program over to a close friend and colleague, Tony Waterston. Tony and I have known and worked together over the last 2 decades or so. Tony's a Scottish pediatrician who, those of you who know Tony, has made huge inroads and has made huge contributions to the health and well-being of children globally. And if there was a person that I learned about climate change first from, it's certainly Tony Waterston. So Tony, thank you for all you do, and thank you for your participation today. Tony.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. And just a very brief introduction to the speakers. First of all, let me say I'm a retired pediatrician in Newcastle upon Tyne in the north of England, and I'm on the scientific committee of ISSOP. We've been having a most interesting time developing these webinars. And just firstly, before I introduce the speakers, how is this going to work? Well, I will give you there are French and Spanish versions that you'll be able to listen to. We'll come to that before we start the videos, because we're showing videos of the speeches. After the videos, there will be a question and answer session, which is live with the speakers. Please, can you start putting your questions in the chat as soon as you think of them? That means really, when anything comes up, put a question in the chat, because we want to get your questions together. We will have plenty of time. We don't have to finish at 6, but you may wish to leave at 6, but we will allow time for as many questions as possible after the talks. There will be a breakout session, and we'll give you details of how the breakout sessions will work. There'll be regional and language breakout rooms, and we'll give you instructions about that before we start them. So let me just introduce the 2 speakers who are, we're very fortunate in having Professor Kevin Anderson, who's a professor in Manchester. He's one of the leading, probably the leading climate scientist in the UK, who's got long experience working with governments as well in relation to climate change. He'll be speaking first about science, some of the science of climate change. He'll be followed by Ruth Etzel, who's an internationally recognized pediatrician and the founding editor of Pediatric Environmental Health. From 2009 to 2012, she led the WHO's activities to protect children from environmental hazards. So we're very fortunate to have these 2 great speakers tonight. I'm now just going to ask, before we start the recordings, I'm just going to ask our technical expert to explain how those who would like to hear French or Spanish can do so. Miguel.
Thank you, Tony. So we're going to utilize the breakout rooms for this. And how you do that is, if you would like to receive the presentation in either Spanish or French, you're going to navigate down to the bottom of your Zoom toolbar, and you should have a breakout rooms button down there. Once you hit that button, it should allow you to go ahead and join either the French subtitle presentation or the Spanish subtitle presentation. Once you do that, you'll be brought into the room, and the moderators will go ahead and start the videos. If you're just wanting to hear the English version, you can just stay right where you are, and we'll have that right up.
Tony, do you want to take it from here?
I think we should just get going as soon as Miguel is ready.
Yep, I'm just pulling up the video right now.
Hello, my name is Kevin Anderson. I'm Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University of Manchester in the UK, and also I hold a role at the University of Uppsala in Sweden and the University of Bergen in Norway. This talk I've titled From Iniquity to Integrity, Paris, 2 degrees centigrade, and Fair Mitigation. I want to start off by thinking about the Paris Agreement, something I hope you're all reasonably familiar with, and that the Paris Agreement commits us to take action to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade compared to the pre-industrial periods before we started to burn coal and other fossil fuels, but also to make efforts to limit the temperature rise to just 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming. And I'll come back to those in a minute. But it also very importantly makes reference to us reducing our emissions in accordance with the best science, and very importantly, and almost always ignored by wealthy countries, on the basis of equity. Now, this presentation focuses on reducing emissions, on mitigation, and it focuses on the energy sector, so the emissions that come basically from burning of fossil fuels. Agricultural emissions are very important. Probably 20, maybe as high as 30% of the warming that we see really relates to emissions from land use and agriculture. They can be reduced significantly by changing our diets and agricultural practices, but they cannot be eliminated. But the majority of the warming we see, the majority of the emissions comes from our burning of fossil fuels. And that's going to be the focus of this presentation. I take the Paris Agreement and our commitments in different countries around the world to the Paris Agreement at face value. I assume we were being honest when we signed the agreement. The talk here is based on the science in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and very much on the concept of equity that's deeply embedded in the Paris Agreement. I ignore political and economic sensibilities, in other words, the concerns of short-term politics. That's not to say that politics and economics aren't important, of course they are, but the whims of our current policymakers, one way or another, are not really that important when we're trying to address the seriousness of climate change. And put these three together, and I think it provides a far more challenging agenda for mitigation, for reducing our emissions, than most other analysis that you'll hear. Now, I'm going to focus on mitigation, but I want to start by touching on issues of impacts. First, let's acknowledge that the 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade challenge is actually itself unjust. Many people around the world are already suffering from just 1 degree centigrade of warming, with extreme weather events exacerbated by the warming that we've put into the atmosphere, whether that's in Mozambique or in the Philippines with Haiyan, or in New York with Sandy, or the coastal strips of Bangladesh. We already have locked in significant impacts to ecosystems. At 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming, that's probably about 3/4 of the barrier reef destroyed. At 2 degrees, almost completely killed off all of the barrier reef. Now that's emblematic, but an emblematic ecosystem, but that's true of many other ecosystems, and we are going to be fundamentally changing them. We are, of course, changing the future for our current children, our own children today. This is what we are doing is very unjust for their futures. What we are already doing is causing many people around the planet to suffer from our emissions and are dying from our emissions, and we've known this for a long time. But these situations will get much worse if the warming goes to 1.5, and then much, much worse if it goes to 2 degrees centigrade. So we are affecting the future for all species on the planet for hundreds of years to come. But unfortunately, we've left it so late that 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees centigrade of warming is now the best that we can achieve. This is a huge change in the weather, in the energy we put into the atmosphere, and therefore on the climate around our planet. We've only seen 1 degree centigrade of warming in all of modern human time for the last 10,000 years. And now we're suddenly, within 50 to 100 years, pushing ourselves to 1, 1.5, 2 degrees centigrade, and probably much higher unless we cut our emissions. Now, I want to now focus back on mitigation. What does the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN body that brings together the science, tell us about the Paris Agreement? Well, I'm going to synthesize all of the IPCC's excellent work in one simple sentence. It's carbon budgets that matter, not long-term targets. It's the total amount of carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere that links to temperature rise, not what we do by 2050 or 2030 or whatever date. And just thinking about this simply from a sort of stylized graphic, it's the area under the curve that matters, the total amount of carbon dioxide. And that means if in the short term, we move into bigger houses, then in the future, we'll have to reduce our emissions even faster to stay within the budget. And I'll try to show that that is simply not possible anymore. So based on the IPCC's latest report, what we can say quite simply here really is that we can say, well, how big is this total carbon budget that we have? And from January 2022, so from the start of next year, we can say, very approximately that for energy emissions to stay below 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade of warming, we can put into the atmosphere around about 600 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And that's our total budget from 2022 out to the end of the century and beyond. Now, that probably means very little to many of you, but in 2019, our emissions were about 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide, dropped obviously a bit last year because of COVID by about 6% or so. But if you put that together, that means about 17 years of 2019 emissions, and we'll have blown our budget for the Paris Agreement for an outside chance of 1.5 and a reasonable chance of staying below 2 in just 17 years. And that's a global number, remember. Now, to understand what action we need to start to control or start to reduce our emissions to stay within our Paris commitments, we need to recognize where we are today. And that does require some significant humility, particularly amongst those of us that are wealthy high emitters. The first IPCC report came out in 1990. Probably some of you listening to this talk were not even born in 1990. In 2019, emissions of carbon dioxide were over 60% higher than they were in 1990. 60% higher in the year of in 2019 than in 1990. And in 2019, they were still going up about just over 0.5%. So despite all of the rhetoric and optimism we've seen over the last 30 years, what we've presided over is really abject failure in terms of reducing emissions. That's not to say people haven't tried. Some people have, but many other people have been not being involved in this, and others have deliberately tried to undermine any change. And we have failed on climate change abysmally. But the news we often hear gives a sort of impression that actually we're demonstrating leadership. We often hear things like we did yesterday, the UK emissions are down 51%, the EU is slashing its emissions, etc., etc. This sort of language about these wonderful leaders. But actually, when you include aviation and shipping emissions, and you include the emissions from imports and exports to areas like the EU 27 or indeed the UK, then what we see is even these so-called climate progressive countries have actually demonstrated no meaningful cut in our carbon dioxide emissions relative to the scale of the challenge for 2 degrees centigrade and even more for 1.5. Just to put the numbers more precisely here, we've seen in the EU and the UK about 13 to 15% cut in 30 years of our carbon dioxide emissions. That's less than half, it's just over rather 0.5% every single year, just 0.5% for some of the wealthiest parts of the world. So why have we managed to, or how have we managed to fail, particularly in the wealthy parts of the world initially, and now more so in China and increasingly in India and other parts of the world? Well, we've had a whole litany of what I call technocratic fraud, and I'm just going to touch on a few of these now. The whole concept of offsetting, paying a poor person to diet for us. If we want to lose weight, we have to cut back on the chocolate. We can't expect someone else to do it for us. And it's the same here. As high emitters, we cannot expect to pay poor people elsewhere in the world to cut back in their emissions so that we can carry on with our high carbon lifestyles. But we've adopted that practice, even in the scientific community, that's often used to use an excuse for flying to international conferences on climate change. At a national level, we've got the Clean Development Mechanism, where we've got state-sanctioned offsetting. So governments, rich governments typically, are saying we'll pay poorer countries to reduce their emissions so that we can carry on business as usual. We've got the concept of afforestation being used in Sweden, but increasingly in other parts of the world, where we plant some trees so that we can expand our airports, hoping that the trees over the next 50 or 100 years will absorb the carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere through our flying. And then very importantly, and I'll come back to this a little bit later, this whole concept now of negative emission technologies. These technologies exist at very small scale or in the imaginations of some academics. And yet in almost every single scenario we have about the future, we assume that they will work at huge planetary scale. something similar to the same size of the current oil and gas industry. But these technologies don't exist at scale today, and yet we assume in virtually every scenario that they will do. What we haven't done in 30 years is tried seriously to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions. Now, I just want to touch on the negative emissions because they're very important in a lot of the analysis, and often people say I'm too critical of them. My position on negative emission technologies, and indeed broader carbon dioxide removal techniques, as they're sometimes referred to, is yes, let's fund the research and development into these sorts of technologies. Let's deploy them if they meet very stringent sustainability criteria, and some of them look like they will make things much worse on broader sustainability and biodiversity indices. But let's reduce our emissions today. Let's mitigate today, assuming negative emissions will not work at scale. And that's particularly important for energy, because we probably will require some carbon dioxide removal or negative emission technologies to compensate from the warming from the residual greenhouse gases from agriculture. So even if we all went to sort of very low meat diets and away from ruminants, then you would still have lots of methane and nitrous oxide, which are serious greenhouse gases. And you cannot eliminate all of those. So what this tells us is that energy needs to be real zero emissions. So what of COVID? Just going to touch on this. Over the last year, in 2020, the best estimate that we have now is that emissions fell globally by about 6%. Now, if that level of reduction could occur year after year after year from now, then that would give us a fighting chance of 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. So that year, which with all the tragedy that was involved and all of the changes in our economies, gives us a feeling of the scale of change that is necessary, hopefully more progressive change than the tragedy of COVID, if we are to deliver on our Paris commitments. But the signs are not particularly good. From the poorest nation to the wealthiest nation, we're all still seeking ongoing economic growth, more energy, more resources, with the sort of language of decoupling, that somehow we can move our economies magically so that they can grow, but without using more resources or more energy. In the time frame that we have, that is simply not possible. It's a myth, this decoupling. Economic growth certainly needs to be welcomed in poorer countries. It improves their quality of life. It's really key. But I think we have to ask the question, is that appropriate in incredibly rich countries like the UK or regions like the EU or the US? It certainly is some of the poorer people in our societies, but on average, I don't think the wealthy countries, the incredibly rich countries, really need lots more economic growth. So let's return now to the Paris Agreement and the commitments we laid out there. We have this global carbon budget. We need to consider now the issue of equity. And equity is absolutely key to the Paris Agreement. All of the climate protocols, going back to the Rio summit in 1992, that some of you may remember, right through to the Paris Agreement, they've all acknowledged that poorer nations will need no longer to make the transition to zero carbon energy, zero carbon overall. So without this generational buck passing, the idea that we'll use negative emissions or our children will use negative emissions in years to come to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So without that, how does the actual total budget play out from an equity perspective? Well, to develop this, we really need to understand the maths and the science of climate change, but we haven't got time to go through that today. So instead of all of that, I'm going to try and think of it in relation to pies, which is a great sort of Northern English delicacy in our diets. So to limit warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade, we know that we have this global carbon pie, and we have some idea of the size, about 600 billion tons from the start of next year. Now, it could be a bit bigger than that. It could be a bit smaller than that. I think with some of the feedbacks that we're likely to see, tipping point sometimes the way it's used in the press, then it's probably going to be a bit smaller. But let's stick with the standard IPCC numbers at the moment, 600 billion tons. And following the equity language of Paris, we have to now consider how to divide that pie between the wealthy parts of the world and the poor parts of the world. Now, in the Paris Agreement, they use the language of developing country parties. So that's the poorer parts of the world. It does include China, but China's income per capita is much lower than that of almost all of the developed country parties. So that's the language in the Paris Agreement. We have to divide the pie between those two. And then we can ask, well, what is a fair slice of this pie for these two groups? And we started off by asking, well, what is the minimum budget, the carbon budget, within which developing country parties could still develop? Because remember, that's locked into the Paris Agreement and all of the other climate protocols. And just touching on that now, there's a lot more work that went into this in a paper which I'll link to later. basically the poorer parts of the world need to collectively reach a peak in their emissions by about 2025. Now that would be probably a bit earlier for China and much later for a country like Rwanda, but collectively by 2025, and then reach zero carbon energy by around 2050. And when you play that out in terms of carbon budgets, you can then ask, well, how much is left? What is the fair slice that is left for the wealthier parts of the world? And it's worth noting here that the carbon budget now at a global level is so small that there's little scope for actually changing the division that we ended up with in our analysis. So unless you assume lots of negative emissions, you're really sort of stuck with this division between the poorer and the wealthier parts of the world if we're going to stick with the equity component of the Paris Agreement and the science embedded in the IPCC. So let's now focus on the developed country parties and see, well, what is the challenge that we're facing here? So what's our fair interpretation of the Paris Agreement for the developed country parties? Well, in terms of a budget, our estimate is that from 2022, we've got somewhere between 70 and 100 billion tons of CO2 that we can emit across the century. Now that's about 7 years of current emissions. I think the wealthy parts of the world are somewhere around about probably 15 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year at the moment, but they're about probably nearer 16 before 16. Sorry, there were 15 in last year, 2020, and about 16 in 2019. So about 7 years. Now, if we translate those budgets into mitigation rates in terms of how fast we have to reduce the emissions every single year, then the headline reduction rate every year for developed countries is something like 10% starting by 2025. So we have to start from where we are today and quickly ramp up to 10%. Remember, that's already 4% greater than we saw in COVID at the global level. But because it takes us a while to do this, we need to again keep on ramping up that reduction rate. So by 2030, we're reducing it about 20% every single year. Now that's a total reduction in the emissions in the wealthy parts of the world. It will vary a bit between the US and Portugal, for instance, but very approximately about a 70 to 75% reduction in total emissions by 2030 compared with 2019. And zero carbon energy by about 2035 to 40. That's real zero, not net zero. That's planes, trains, ships, industry, homes, cars, everything. Zero carbon energy. Now this is massively challenging. We should have started in 1990. We've chosen to fail since then, and we are where we are. We've used up most of the carbon budget. So now we are facing immediate and profound system change. Why is this so different to net zero analysis? Well, typically, net zero analysis tends to not include an explicit carbon budget framing. It tends to use some sort of long-term target of 2030, 2040, nor more typically 2050. So it's not directly linked to a temperature commitment like 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. Typically, they're very heavily reliant on future generations using some sort of carbon dioxide removal, negative emission technology, whatever it may be. And almost always these net zero analysis pays just lip service, pretty much ignores the whole concept of international equity, which is sort of embedded in this awful concept of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. Actually, the acronym there is wrong. That should be CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities, a really important part of the international negotiations. So now I'm trying to draw all of this together to conclude. The headline choice for developed nations, for the wealthy parts of the world, is that if our preference is to ignore international equity, to pass a huge burden onto our children, to be part of a 2.5 to 3 degree C future, and to effectively renege on our Paris commitments. But that does allow us to dovetail with today's politics, to maintain the current economic market model, and really just have sort of sizable adjustments to business as usual. So it's just incremental, but reasonable size adjustments to business as usual. Then that's something like a 5% per annum mitigation rate, a cut in emissions every single year, and net zero by about 2050. So relying on lots and lots of negative emissions later on in the century to be deployed by our children. If alternatively our preference is to take international equity seriously, then we have to have a huge mitigation effort by this generation, by us. We have to cut our emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, particularly in line with well below 2 degrees centigrade, and we have to abide, therefore, by our Paris commitments. Now, in doing this, we have to recognize this means a huge ramp up in government intervention. driving obviously change within the public sector, but also in the private sector. A profound and rapid reshaping of our economics, and immediate and deep cuts across all of our sectors. There are no exempt sectors in this. And this is a mitigation rate, as I've said before, somewhere between 10 and 20% every single year, and real zero by somewhere around 2035, at the outside by 2040, real zero emissions. Delivering on Paris means that we'll have to focus on new narratives because we've left it so late. We have to ask questions about what constitutes growth, progress, and development. Is it just about economic growth? Is it about growth in female literacy, about reduced crime, about better air quality, about more job security? You know, how are we going to measure success in our societies and progress? We have to reframe the whole concept of value and how we reward success, if we reward it at all. We typically value things by a monetary value, and we typically reward people by paying them more money. In other words, they get more money, they buy more resources, they therefore often have more emissions, and it's a lot more unsustainable. Is that an appropriate way of rewarding success and valuing things in our society? We need to develop a much more sort of sophisticated relationship with time. We tend to focus increasingly, particularly in the Western part of the world, on the short term. We need to think much more about the future, about our children's future. And in fact, beyond that, think about what we're doing for hundreds of years to come, but also learn lessons from history. So a much more sort of sophisticated relationship with time. We need to think about intra and intergenerational equity, about other poor people elsewhere in the world in climate vulnerable zones who are already suffering the impacts of the climate change that us high emitters have imposed upon them. But also think about intergenerational equity, how we're passing this on to our children and our children's children. But beyond thinking of it in terms of humans, we have to think of our role and our part, and have a greater and deeper appreciation of the more than human world. We're not abstract from this richer world. We're part of it. And we have to start to understand that, I think, in a much deeper way than we have done historically. In 2020, climate change has become system change, and it's become system change because we have chosen to fail to reduce our emissions for so long. As Einstein noted, or at least it's attributed to him, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And thus far, we in our generation, particularly the high emitters amongst us, have chosen to pass on to our own children the consequences of 30 years of such insanity. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much for listening. And I believe there's going to be a Q&A later on. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer some of those. There's these two links here, which we can pass on to you electronically, relate to a paper that underpins a lot of the analysis within this presentation, and also to an article that we've written, which is an easier read than plowing through a typical academic paper. So as I say, thanks for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Hello to everyone.
Thank you
I'm
very
really
much,
happy
Kevin.
to be here today, and I
Wonderful.
appreciate the opportunity to help launch the declaration of the International Society for Social Pediatrics and Child Health, otherwise known as ISSOP. The declaration is about responding to the impact of the climate crisis on children and youth. I have a little laryngitis today, so please bear with me if my voice is a little scratchy. The declaration includes 29 recommendations in 3 areas. Things we can do in practice, such as becoming a personal role model, as well as addressing climate change in our clinics and hospitals. Then there are things that we can do in our teaching and education. And finally, there are things that we can do as advocates. I won't be going into all 29 recommendations right now, but I would like to highlight a selection of them in order to give you a sense of this document. One of the reasons for this declaration is that, as this slide shows, only about 20% of overall health status can be attributed to healthcare itself. The other 80% depends on social and structural determinants, as well as ecological determinants. Often, we in pediatrics don't do enough to address these determinants, and it's actually one of the reasons that this society was formed. Kevin Anderson reminded us just now of the science that shows the changes in our Earth's climate. The climate crisis we face now reminds me of the story of Marie Curie's life. Of course, we all know that she died of radiation. What you may not remember is that for her entire life, she denied that her illness had anything to do with radiation. This is from a poem by Adrienne Rich that says, "She died a famous woman, denying her wounds. Denying her wounds came from the same source as her power." So many of us in the industrialized world are still denying that our wounds come from the same source as our power, which is fossil fuel. We need to keep saying over and over, as beautifully as we can, that this situation is of our own creation and can be ended as it began by the power of our choices. We can focus on choices at 5 levels. First, our personal choices matter. Then our practice choices matter. The hospital choices matter. Our teaching choices matter. And our advocacy choices matter. Let's start with personal choices. The Declaration recommends that we serve as personal role models for practices that promote environmental sustainability. What does that look like? Maybe the first step in becoming a role model is calculating your carbon footprint. There are a variety of carbon footprint calculators, but one of the most used is shown here. I highly recommend taking the time to do this. Here's an illustration of my own carbon footprint. I calculated it for the year from March 2019 to February 2020, BC. You know what BC stands for, right? Before COVID. I had to enter my annual heating and cooling bills, the number of miles I drove, and each trip I took by airplane, among other things. The program then told me that my carbon footprint was 13.93 metric tons of carbon dioxide. To put this into perspective, the carbon footprint for an average American was 16.5 metric tons. But to meet the Paris commitments, each of us should aim for a carbon footprint of only 2 metric tons per year. So I had to look at the sources of my CO2 emissions in order to figure out where I might reduce my carbon footprint. This chart shows where the average American's carbon emissions come from. You can see that the biggest chunk is transportation. It accounts for 28% of the average American's emissions. 26% comes from stuff you buy, 17% from home heating and cooling, 15% from other home energy use, and 14% from food. Then, just as I was beginning to come to grips with the need to do something to reduce my carbon footprint, COVID surfaced and life changed for everybody. So what did that mean for my carbon footprint? Look at this. It dropped by more than half to 6.24 metric tons during the first year of COVID. Of course, it was still not down to that pesky 2 metric tons that I needed to meet, but it was a pretty big drop. I had that drop mainly because in a typical year, I do a fair amount of international travel. For example, the year before COVID, I took a trip to Beijing, one to Geneva, and one to Milwaukee. You can see the carbon footprint of each trip here. It's clear that even one international trip uses up almost the whole 2 metric tons for the year. That is why the Declaration recommends that we reduce the carbon footprint associated with professional meetings, including reducing flying, as well as contracting with green facilities and organizations, and offering primarily vegetarian, climate conscious, and locally sourced meals. This slide shows the impact of various steps to reduce carbon emissions. The actions in green are considered high impact actions. On the far left, you can see that the most high impact action is to have 1 fewer child. That's because carbon dioxide comes from fossil fuel consumption, and one less consumer makes a big difference. Other high impact actions are to live car-free, to avoid one transatlantic flight, to buy green energy, to buy a more efficient car, to switch electric car to car-free, and to choose a plant-based diet. Then there are some moderate impact actions, which are shown in blue. These include replacing a gas-powered car with a hybrid car, washing clothes in cold water, recycling, and hang-drying clothes. And on the far right in yellow, there's one low-impact action, upgrading light bulbs. This slide shows a comparison of the kilograms of CO2 produced by a pound of each food listed and the equivalent number of miles that you would travel in a car to emit the same amount. So changing to a plant-based diet can really reduce your carbon emissions. Of course, when you take these steps that are good for the environment, it's a win-win situation because they're also good for health. When you walk or take a bicycle, you burn calories instead of carbon. More active transport cleans the air and fights obesity. When you eat fresh, local, and lower on the food chain, it supports local farms and the local economy, improves nutritional quality, and lowers the risk of chronic diseases. And of course, energy efficiency saves money, and we know that wealth supports health. The Declaration also recommends that we purchase local and recycled goods and avoid disposable products. As I showed you earlier, 26% of the average person's carbon emissions come from stuff we buy. As Tony Costello said last month, we need to reassess our rampant consumerism in order to address the climate crisis. But it's crystal clear that individual action alone is not enough. That is why the Declaration recommends that we build coalitions to address climate change through education, advocacy, and civil action. We must all speak out together about the importance of change. We must demand local, national, and international policies and strategies that rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and ensure preparedness for climate-associated extreme weather events. We must advocate for alternate and healthier forms of transportation for all to reduce air pollution and dependency on carbon-producing vehicles. We must advocate for sustainable and renewable electricity generating systems, accessible transportation, plant-based and regeneratively produced food, and equitable access to green spaces that improve the lives of children and families. So how do our practice choices matter? There are many things that we can do in practice. The Declaration says that we should use the framework of anticipatory guidance at office visits for discussing climate change with families. But how do we begin that discussion? A recent article from the Annals of Internal Medicine suggests that in a visit with a patient with asthma, you might approach it by saying something like this: climate change and air pollution are caused by the same thing, burning fossil fuels. Together, they make air quality worse, and that can make lung disease worse. Checking air quality and avoiding busy roadways when you go out for exercise can help protect you. The choices that are made in your hospital also matter. Healthcare contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. The only buildings in the US that use more energy per square foot than hospitals are supermarkets. On this slide, you can see some of the ways that hospitals emit greenhouse gases: heating, cooling, lighting, and water use, waste and aesthetic gases, emissions from meat productions and food transport, emissions from employee commutes, emissions from waste hauling and treatment and landfill gases, the hospital's fleet vehicles, and emissions from the supplies and materials that the hospital purchases. That's why the declaration recommends that we work to reduce the carbon and environmental footprint of health facilities, including strategies to increase energy efficiency, incorporate renewable energy sources, and reduce waste. Some hospitals have already decided to go carbon neutral, and I know that those in the UK have made tremendous progress. If your hospital hasn't yet taken action, you might want to ask if they have a sustainability committee, and if they don't, ask if you can form one. Your teaching choices also matter. The declaration recommends that we promote education of child health professionals at all levels of training and in all venues of practice on all aspects of the climate crisis. This means during medical school, during residency, as well as in continuing medical education programs. The World Health Organization has developed a wonderful series of training modules that can be used off the shelf to teach students, residents, and others about climate change and other environmental health issues. There are over 30 modules, all with detailed speakers' notes and complete references. And you can get them by going to the WHO website featured here. Finally, your advocacy choices matter. The climate crisis is a child rights crisis. It's also an environmental justice crisis because the people causing it are not the ones most affected, and the people most affected are not the ones causing it. The children of the world know this. They are upset and afraid about what it means for their futures. We can make a choice to follow the lead of the teenagers around the world who've been raising their voices for the last 30 years, but often they have not received the support that they need. This is why the declaration recommends that we advance and support children's own advocacy and mitigation efforts on the climate crisis. But we cannot leave it to the young people. All of us need to engage because it is so hard and we simply don't have time to lose. We hope that you will consider joining us by taking on some of the actions suggested in this declaration. If you would like to sign the declaration, you can let Professor Jeff Goldhagen, the president of the Society, know by sending him an email message at this address. So we've come to the end, and I'd like to leave you with an old Chinese proverb that I like very much. It says, "Be not afraid of going slowly. Be only afraid of standing still." Thank you. We'll now go to
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, both speakers. We're not going to the breakout rooms quite yet. Those were amazing talks. When I first heard Kevin Anderson about 5 years ago, it made me really open my eyes. And as a result of that, I'm really trying to devote most of my time to climate change advocacy. And thank you so much to Ruth for that most interesting talk. And really what always comes up in discussion is, what is your own carbon footprint? I really recommend measuring it. And also the comparative value of personal change as against system change. And my view is that we have to show personal change to actually get the politicians to bring about the change that really is going to make the difference. So we're going to go into questions now. Kevin is with us. He's already been very helpfully answering some questions in the chat. Thank you very much for that, Kevin. We're going to have, I think we should have at least 15 minutes, if people don't mind going on till about 6:05 with questions.
Tony, can I interrupt for 1 second? Have our colleagues in the French and Spanish breakout rooms, have they been able to join us yet? Do we know?
Unfortunately, the Spanish didn't work. I tried 3 times, but didn't work, Jeff.
From the French breakout room, we've returned here now.
Great. Sorry.
Okay. So anyway, there are people who put in questions. You're welcome to put in questions now. And I'm going to hand over to Eva to actually, who's been looking at the questions, to identify some questions now. Eva.
Yes, so we can go ahead and start with one that hasn't been answered yet. Some argue using the terms majority world instead of developing nations and minority world instead of developed nations is more reflective of the world. Do you think that if the global climate effort is rethought in this framework, it would have a meaningful effect moving forward?
Yeah, no, firstly, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. And secondly, I apologize. I'm actually in a strange hospital bed at the moment because I've had a bicycle accident. So that's why I'm in this odd bed with the handle above me. I think actually reframing the language or moving away from the language of developed and developing would be a really good thing. And I quite warm to the idea of minority and majority world. I think there's something about that. The reason I use developed and developing there is sadly it's the one that's locked into the Paris Agreement, and it's the one that's been used at climate negotiations for many years. That said, I think it would be good to look for something different. I always prefer industrial and industrialized because they don't seem to give to me a sense of one being better than the other. As developed and developing, it sort of privileges developed world as somehow that is a better thing to be than the developing world. Well, I think there are many bad things in the developed world, which I talked about in the chat. So yes, maybe that language of minority and majority world would be a positive step forward and would remind us in the wealthy world, of course, that we are the minority. 1.5 billion people roughly in the developed world and 6 billion in the developing world.
Ruth, do you want to come in on that?
My own personal preference is to talk about industrialized and less industrialized countries, because in fact, the way we're emitting carbon depends on how industrialized we are. And so I tend to prefer that, but just a personal opinion.
Eva?
Eva, you're on mute.
Oh, thank you. Sort of piggybacking off of that, when we talk about developed and developing countries, what do we understand by development? And is it possible for developing countries to become developed?
There's some useful work out there, which is sort of captured in quite a popular book called The Spirit Level, but there's also quite a lot of academic work carried out by Julia Steinberger, William Lamb, and others. And what they've done, they've looked at a whole sort of series of indices of quality of life. That can be life expectancy, it can be female literacy, it can be crime, it can be a whole set of things. And when you plot those for all the countries of the world, what you find are not the usual suspects in the sort of sweet spot. There is a sweet spot on there, and I'm not saying that they're in any way ideal or perfect countries, but it's places like Cuba and Costa Rica. There aren't even Scandinavian countries in there. And so these countries actually have high life expectancy and hit most of the indices quite well, and yet have low emissions and quite low sustainability implications. So perhaps they're the ones which, if we are going to look at any countries to learn some lessons from, I don't think we should be emulating them, but learn some lessons from, they're not the usual suspects. They're not countries we would typically classify as developed, actually. And yet they do have a high quality of life in most respects, in no way perfect. So I think we need to move away from the idea that a developed country is something that developing countries should be aiming to emulate. And actually, I think developed countries like the UK should be looking elsewhere in the world and at other societies for good examples of what prosperous, sustainable, low carbon societies might look like.
Ruth, do you want to?
No, I totally concur with Kevin on that one.
I will add one thing to that, and I've reflected on this recently. I had a pretty serious bicycle crash about 10, 11 weeks ago. And one wonderful thing about being in a developed country, let's call it that, is our National Health Service. And I was scraped off the road by an ambulance people, taken to the hospital, had surgery, looked after, sent home with physiotherapy. And actually, I think we have to remind ourselves how privileged that is. That was a wonderful system at work. So there are elements in developed countries that I think really do demonstrate what a civilized society looks like. But in no way would I call us a civilized society. I think Gandhi was right. It's a nice idea, civilization, but we haven't yet achieved it.
Okay, Eva?
Given the importance of staying within our budget, what say you to new investments in fracked gas pipelines, both for gas-fired power plants and gas stoves in the US?
Yeah, I did put a note in the chat about this. Absolutely opposed to it. I've done quite a lot of work on gas, and particularly shale gas, actually going right the way back, fracked gas, if you like, going back to first report was 2011, I think. Just to be clear, fracked gas is just gas. It's just methane. It's the same as natural gas. There's a few differences, very minor differences, but virtually identical. Gas is methane. Methane is CH4. 75% of the mass of a kilo of gas is carbon. When you burn it, you get loads of carbon dioxide. It's not as bad as coal, but it is still terrible. So the idea that industrialized parts of the world, like the EU and the US indeed, are trying to get more and more gas and claiming it's a transition fuel, a low carbon fuel. It's not a low carbon fuel. It's a very high energy source option. And there's no way it is a transition fuel. So we need to move away from gas very rapidly, particularly in the wealthy parts of the world. It is better than, it's less worse than coal. So if you're in China making the shift from coal to gas, you could argue it's better. The problem is you mustn't lock in an infrastructure of gas, because you then need to move off the gas very quickly as well.
All right. Next is more of a comment that maybe you could reply to. I read that the wealthiest 10% in the world use 45% of the carbon budget. So is it those people who need to make, it is those people who need to make the cuts and are best able to afford to change their lifestyles?
Yeah, again, this is another thing I've been working on for years, actually. Yeah, it's roughly 50% of half of global emissions come from 10% of the population. And I think it's something like, there's some work by Sivan Cartham and others, I think it's based in New York now, that shows something like 1 to 2% of the population emits something like 50, there's more than the bottom, I think it's the bottom 40 or 50%. So there's some really weird sort of ways that the emissions are skewed to particular groups of people. And yes, so if the top 10% of global emitters, and they're spread around the world, about 2/3 of them in the wealthy parts of the world and about 1/3 of them living in the poor parts of the world, if that top 10% reduce their carbon footprint to the level of the average European citizen, the average EU citizen, so the average EU citizen is not a poor person, and that would not be enough, but that would reduce global emissions by about 1/3. Just think of the numbers of that. If the other 90% of the world made no change, and just the top 10% reduced to the level of the average European, that's a 1/3 cut in global emissions. It shows you how the emissions of carbon dioxide are massively skewed to the very wealthy. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't think they're in the very wealthy category. Professors like me, we don't like to think we're in the very wealthy category, but of course we are. And so I think this is a really important issue, that equity is at the heart of responding to our climate change commitments. The problem for me is that who are the people in that group? They're the policymakers, the academics, the barristers, the journalists, all the people that frame the climate change agenda are in that group of high emitters. So we're asking the foxes to guard the chicken coop.
I think that's right. And one of the issues for pediatricians is that we never think of ourselves as wealthy, because in fact, when you look at all different medical professionals, pediatricians are usually right at the bottom of the heap in terms of the amount that they earn. Nonetheless, as you point out so correctly, we are really among the very well-paid professionals, given what the rest of the world experiences. And that is why it's so important for us in our organizational life and in our personal life to be role models at reducing our emissions. And I think that looks to the importance of declaration and trying to get each of our pediatricians around the world to try to get people in their local area to start walking the walk.
Great. Okay. I know you touched on this in the chat, but do you see a future for flying using solar or other energy sources? Will it be rich people only, or can we get used to slower forms of traveling?
If we premise all of this in delivering on our Paris commitments, and if we don't deliver on those, remember what we're saying then is that the impacts of climate change will anyway stop us flying, and it will anyway stop us living good quality of lives. So the reason we're aiming for Paris is that we can have good quality of lives. But But the problem for that is that actually the carbon budgets are so small. And you look at something like aviation, there are no technical opportunities for aviation in the short to medium term. Lots of people love talking about electric planes or biofuel. But if you play these things out and say, how long will it take for those to penetrate the aviation market significantly? Well, decades. And even the people who work on this say typically it's going to be 2040, 2050 before we get significant amounts of these. And yet we need these very quickly. So in the interim, we have to cut back on how often we fly. And I personally think a frequent flyer levy is one way of doing that, whereby your first flight is at the normal price. I would go for this, a geometric one. The second flight is twice the price. The third flight is four times. The fourth flight is 8 times. And actually, if you do that, you even stop the multimillionaires. It's the old story of the prince putting the grain of sand on the grain of rice on the first square on a chessboard, and 2 on the second, and 4 on the third. The geometrical implications of that. Before you take 10 flights, you'd be paying £1 million per flight. You take 15 flights, you'd be paying £40 million a flight. And that geometric way is really good because it stops the wealthy from flying a lot. So I think there are ways around this from that demand management point of view. But we have to be serious about this. If you look at the UK, 70% of all the flights are carried out by 15% of the population. In any one year, over half the UK population does not fly. Flying is something that's carried out by the privileged, and then we blame the few people who occasionally fly once a year on holiday or once every second year. They're not the people that are driving it. It's the frequent flyers that are driving aviation. And just to say, as an academic, we can manage without it. I stopped flying in 2004. So yeah,
I think Kevin is right. And, I heard a talk by Bill Gates a couple of weeks ago. He just put out his new book, and somebody asked him about flying, and he said, oh yeah, I have my private jet, but don't worry, I'm the biggest green fuel consumer, and I spend, what did he say, the biggest individual customer of the green fuel of anybody in the whole world. And I was so chagrined by that answer, because in fact, he should be a role model at showing that he cuts back on his use of his personal jet instead of saying that he's the biggest customer of green fuel. And it's why many of our organizations would do well to have organizational promises that they will cut back on these big international conferences. And we're trying to push more and more pediatric societies to go online, even in the post-COVID days.
I think one thing is really important worth bearing in mind here, and it's the point that that Gates simply doesn't get the science, or he doesn't like the science because it says something too challenging about his own lifestyle, is that every litre of sustainable fuel he uses is a litre in his private jet or anywhere else, is a litre that cannot be used in a bus in New York or in a hospital, keep a hospital theatre running with its lights. And so he is taking away the limited amount of sustainable fuels that we have at the moment and using them for his own private privilege. And then he claims that that is a positive move. I like this idea we take a triage approach. Because we have really limited sustainable energy at the moment, we can have lots more of it, but at the moment we have very limited amounts. We have to use it where it does the most amount of public good and worthwhile sort of feedback. And that's generally in things like public transport. So let's have sustainable buses and buildings and energy systems. Let's not put that into the use for people to live very high energy consumption, private, profligate lifestyles, which is exactly what he was arguing for. He completely misunderstands the basic science of climate change.
Okay, I think that's Bill Gates put in his place. Quite right. I think we've only got time for one more question, because we need to have a little wind up for 1 minute afterwards. So Eva, are you able to choose one more question?
Sure. Your discussion of net zero targets was very interesting. Have you written, or do you know any resources that go into more detail on how the concept of net zero is defined?
This is an ongoing, very hot topic, this whole net zero. There's a lot being written on it, and it's very much dependent on a particular set of usually technologies, these negative emission technologies that don't exist at scale. There's a few pilot plants, but they're mostly in the imagination of academics. But the plan is that not the plan for us, of course, the plan is for you and people of your generation to actually put these in place in 2050 and beyond to remove our carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now, there's a lot written about those. I'll put a link in the chat in a second to something that I wrote with a colleague a few years ago. But there's lots more out there. If you look at negative emission technologies, you'll see lots and lots of literature about this. And most of us who are very critical of it are not opposed to the research. I'm not even opposed to pursuing these things if they work. What we're opposed to is to assuming that they will work and therefore not making big cuts today. And we're already doing that. Policies today are already much weaker in terms of reducing emissions because of the belief that policymakers have that in the future, our children and our children's children will remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that frames the net zero debate. So it's really worth trying to understand that. That's not to say that we shouldn't pursue these things, but we shouldn't rely on them to allow us to carry on with business as usual, which is effectively what we're doing. But I'll put a link into something you can access from, it was published in Science, I think.
Okay, well, it's been amazing. And I'm really so grateful to Kevin Anderson and to Ruth Etzel for really making us think again. And I think the final words to take away are our system change, that it's the only way forward, but can we do it? So the declaration will help. So I think we're going to.
Can I interrupt 1 second? There was just a question in the chat. Can you mention again that the recordings will be up on the ISSOP website on YouTube?
I'm going to say that. Firstly, that the declaration has been sent out, but will be sent out again. So please read it, please use it, please try and get signatories to the declaration. The recording will be available within the next few days on the ISSOP website of the whole talk. So, and we really would like it to be disseminated as widely as possible, because these things need to be known. They're not known. They need to be known and understood. Telling the truth is our first role. So now we're going to go into the breakout rooms. I hope as many of you as possible will stay for a further hour or so, or up till about 7 anyway, for group discussions that are going to be both regional and language breakout rooms. You will find these in the breakout room section. You can choose which room you go to. And I'm going to say goodbye to everyone now, and thank you, a big thank you again to Kevin and Ruth, and hope to see you all again another time in some of the breakout rooms. Don't forget, there's another webinar this time next month. Do please come back and join us for that one.